Alright everyone, welcome back to another video. Last time we left off with part 2, the Young Republic, talking about the little prelude before we get into the Young Republic era of the United States. And now, we're on to making the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton laid a very precise finger on the chief defect of the Articles of Confederation. We may indeed be said to have reached almost the last stage of national humiliation. The great and radical vice in the construction of the existing Confederation is the principle of legislation for states or governments in their corporate or collective capacities as contradistinguished from the individuals of which they consist. The United States has an indefinite discretion to make requisitions for men and money, but they have no authority to raise either. By regulations, I actually just skipped a part. No, I didn't. By regulations extending to the individual citizens. Though in theory their resolutions concerning these objects are laws, constitutionally binding on the members of the Union, yet in practice they are merely recommendations which the states observe or disregard at their own option. More briefly stated, the National Congress had legislative power, but no executive power. That belonged to the states. For example, the peace had provided that loyalists who had been deprived of their property should be reimbursed. Congress recommended that the states do this, but some of them failed to do so, which gave the British an excuse for holding on to certain forts in the Northwest, which, by treaty, should have reverted to the United States. There were other difficulties. One was the danger that some states might enact tariffs against the rest, or swept by radical impulse, might deny the obligation of contracts, repudiate public or private debts, and issue inflated currency. One great forward step was made before the Constitution was ratified, settling the territorial claims of certain seaboard states, especially Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, to land beyond the Appalachians. The British disregard of these rights under colonial charters had been one cause of the Revolution, and now the question arose in a new form. States without charter claims were jealous of those who had them. Moreover, these claims at times overlapped and conflicted. A very sensible solution was reached. The new states with Western claims were induced to release them, after conceding certain settlement rights to their veterans of the Revolutionary War. The whole Northwest between the Ohio River and the Great Lakes became territories of the nation. Slavery was forbidden and certain lands set aside for schools. Territories were encouraged to hope that, when their population was large enough, Congress would permit them to organize as states, equal in rights with the original 13. Territories were also founded in the Southwest, with the significant difference that there was no prohibition on slavery. Apart from the original 13, nearly all states had a previous existence as territories with appointed governors, but local legislatures. There were some exceptions. Maine was carved out of Massachusetts, Kentucky and West Virginia from Virginia. Vermont from the land disputed by New York and New Hampshire, and Texas was originally an independent republic. At first, it was considered sufficient to amend the Articles of Confederation, granting increased powers to the federal government, but when the Constitutional Convention finally met, it took matters into its own hands and decided to make an entirely new constitution to go into effect when ratified by 9 of the 13 states. The convention met privately and as a small, business-like body. Most of its members had some previous experience. They knew that to make a constitution at all, there would have to be compromises. The resulting instrument was not, perhaps, what any one of the delegates would have made if left to themselves. And it had been amended many times, but it was real, not, like so many constitutions, a mere scrap of paper. The chief compromise was between larger states and less populous ones. Congress was divided into two parts, a House of Representatives based upon population, and a Senate, in which each state was entitled to 2 senators. There was to be a president, elected for 4 years by a special electoral college, and a federal judiciary. The slave states were given a compromise in the number of representatives and presidential electors. Slaves would count as 3/5 of a free man, and the slave trade with Africa was not to be forbidden until 1808. Thomas Jefferson, who was abroad on a mission to France, liked the Constitution in general, but he and others pointed out the need for a Bill of Rights, specifying in detail the rights of individual citizens. These were speedily adopted and formed the first 10 amendments. They include the freedom of speech and of press, freedom of religious worship, and guarantees against arbitrary arrest and punishment. The real difficulty was not in making a constitution, but getting it ratified. Some states, such as Delaware and Pennsylvania, approved it quickly, but others hung in doubt. The fight was especially keen in Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York. A union from which any of these was absent would be scarcely conceivable. So, James Madison of Virginia and Alexander Hamilton of New York wrote a series of able state papers, the Federalists, explaining and defending the new Constitution. Hamilton would personally have liked far more centralized government, but he championed the Constitution as the best then obtainable. Finally, all but North Carolina and Rhode Island had ratified it. Their position was now insecure, so they soon joined as well, and all 13 states were bound by its terms. Another compromise, not directly a part of the Constitution, was the location of the new national capital. Philadelphia in the north had served during the first days of the Republic. Hamilton wanted states' debts to be taken over by the national government. To secure this, he had agreed to move the capital to a southern location between Maryland and Virginia on the Potomac River. Here, an independent district, the District of Columbia, was established, and the capital was named after George Washington. At first, the national flag was to have a new star and a stripe for each state, but soon the states became inconventionally numerous, and the stripes began to resemble a barber's pole. So it was finally decided to have a new star for each state, but keep the 13 stripes in honor of the original 13 states. Yeah, there's the Articles of Confederation, they had to get rid of that stuff. The Articles of Confederation had no power. And a government can't have no power. It just doesn't work. Because then what's the point of the government? Especially in an instance like the United States, where each state has its own centralized power. So why do you need a federalized power then? If federalized power has no power, then it doesn't make any sense. And so then eventually the whole idea of the Confederation or the Union would not work because, well, you don't need it. So, yeah, getting rid of that was such a good idea. And yeah, many compromises were made. And even one of the ways that these guys got a lot of these people to show up, even, because originally a lot of these people did not want to show up for this. They didn't want to. They thought it was kind of dumb. and things like that. However, uh, one of the ways that they got this was they said, "Hey, George Washington's going to be there," and everyone's like, "Oh, okay, we'll go see George." And so they show up and then basically lock the doors behind them when they all show up and say, "Hey, we're gonna get this worked out here, guys." And it's kind of how it happened. Kind of funny, really, when you put it that way. But now we'll get into the pictures here. Below here is a cartoon poem from the Centennial, a Massachusetts newspaper dated the 2nd of August, 1788. It urged the two states that had not ratified the Constitution to do so. Yeah, you can see all the pillars and then these last two. And yeah, I mean, these last two states, they're going to pretty quickly, North Carolina and then Rhode Island, because like it said, they're going to feel very out of place then. It's like, oh crap, if we don't do this, like, they were kind of worried, like, well, what's going to happen to us kind of thing. So they quickly ratify it, like, hey, yeah, we'll join, you know, kind of thing. So up here is the signing of the Constitution in Philadelphia, 1787. George Washington had retired to Mount Vernon, his estate in Virginia, in 1783, after the war. When the Constitutional Convention gathered in 1787, he was pressed into the national service again as the head of the Virginia delegation, and was promptly elected president of the convention. Yeah, they elect Washington for two reasons. One, he's a Southern guy technically because he's from Virginia, so he's very unifying, and then also because he was the commander in chief during the war, he was the continental general. He was a leader of all the armies of the United States at that time. People really respected him, and so yeah, put him in charge. People are gonna respect him, and then that's kind of why he becomes president. Not kind of why. That is why he basically gets begged into being president. The bottom here is Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, who established the national credit on a firm basis, made use of the taxing power of the nation, and created a banking system. Yeah, he is Hamilton. If he would have been allowed, he would have allowed a king, which people very much had to rage against, and they definitely did. Um, Hamilton liked the idea of strong centralization. I mean, they talked about that. He would have liked a little bit more strong. But yeah, he as Secretary of the Treasury, he tries to do his best. Did some of the things he'd do really help? Who can say? Who can say? At the top here is the plan of the city of Washington in the District of Columbia. The district was established by Congress in 1790 to 91, and it was George Washington who selected the exact site for the federal city. The capital for the United States was moved from Philadelphia to Washington in 1800, and Thomas Jefferson was the first president to be inaugurated in the new city. Yeah, D.C. is also like a swamp, and Washington probably did this too because it's not too far from his home. Just saying. He probably did this so once they basically forced him to be president, he probably was like, that's a good place for it. Right there, guys. Right there. Yep. Even though he never would even go there. So, I mean, like, as president, I should say. At the bottom here is the Federalist #1 from the New York Independent Journal of the 27th of October, 1787. These articles were writings in defense of the Constitution made anonymously by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Later, they were collected and published in a book entitled The Federalist. They still constitute the best commentary available on the Constitution as the framers intended it to be interpreted. Yeah, The Federalist, good read. Explains a lot. If you ever want to look at how they kind of thought of things, definitely look into the Federalist. You can kind of get an idea of how some of the people thought at one point. Not all of them, but some of them. And above is the chambers of the House of Representatives in Philadelphia, where John Adams presented the Bill of Rights on the 22nd of September, 1789. Yeah, very beautiful building, of course. Yeah, and obviously the Bill of Rights, super important to Americans today. We have a lot of things in there that help us with our rights, and very, very important. But that's going to do it for this video. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you have anyone who's going to improve these videos, leave a comment down below. I always appreciate your feedback. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.